The night is quiet, suffocating, the kind of silence that makes your skin prickle because you know deep down something is wrong. A car sits parked between the shadows of an empty Florida parking lot. Inside is an 18-year-old girl, Kaylin, glowing with the faint hope of a future she's barely begun to imagine. She thinks she's meeting someone who claims he wants to talk about their unborn son. But what she doesn't know is that the person walking toward her is a man who has already decided she doesn't deserve to see tomorrow. Because sometimes evil doesn't arrive in a mask or with a warning. Sometimes it shows up wearing the face of someone who once promised you love. This is the story of how a young mother-to-be fought to protect her child, and how the man who resented that unborn child planned the unthinkable. But it's also the story of something far bigger, the pursuit of justice, carried out by people who refuse to let Kaylin's voice go silent. Tonight, you will hear what really happened, and you will feel what justice looks like when it finally arrives. If you've ever felt that burning need for justice, that feeling when someone crosses a line so brutally you can almost taste the rage, then hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me, because this is one of the most disturbing, tragic, and ultimately satisfying justice stories you'll hear this year. Kaylin Fiengo wasn't the kind of girl who filled a room with noise. She filled it with presence. There was something gentle about her, something soft but grounded. A way she listened when people spoke, like their words were puzzle pieces she was trying to figure out. She had one of those smiles, the warm, almost embarrassed kind, that made people feel safe around her. But beneath that softness was something stronger, resolve. She was only 18, barely stepping into adulthood, barely learning what independence tasted like. Yet she was already facing a decision many grown adults would crumble under. And she had made her choice. She was keeping her baby, not because she was naive, not because she didn't understand how hard it would be, but because when she placed her hand on her belly and felt the faint, fluttering life inside, something inside her whispered, "He's mine." She was going to be a mother. She was going to protect her son. Even if the baby's father, Donovan Faison, hated that decision. I know he's angry. I know he thinks I ruined his life, but can't he see it? This little heartbeat inside me, this is a person. My responsibility. Even if he doesn't want to be a father, I do want to be a mother. Why isn't that enough? Why can't he just let me love my own child? The messages Donovan sent her over the weeks were cold enough to frost skin. Sharp words, clipped thumbs, resentment pouring through a digital screen. He wasn't confused. He wasn't scared. He was angry. Angry that Kaylin wouldn't get an abortion. Angry that she had made a choice he couldn't control. Angry that her love for her unborn son outweighed her fear of him. He felt disrespected. He felt cornered. And in his mind, the only way out was to eliminate the problem. That problem was a girl who had once trusted him, and a baby who had never taken a breath. She thinks I'm gonna let her ruin my life? She's stupid, naive. She doesn't get how hard I've worked. She doesn't get what a kid would do to my plans. I told her to handle it. I told her what needed to be done. But she's not listening. She's being selfish. And if she won't fix this, then I will. This wasn't a sudden snap of anger. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditation, the jealousy, the possessiveness, the control. It had all been building like storm pressure behind a closed window, and he had already begun deciding how the storm would break. Kaylin, meanwhile, was unaware of just how deeply his resentment ran. She knew he was angry, yes, but hate? The kind of hate that murders? She still believed some part of the boy she once liked was in there. She still believed that meeting him would settle things. After all, he had asked to talk. He had initiated the meeting. He told her they needed to figure things out, and despite the tension, despite the distance growing between them, Kaylin held on to one last thread of hope. That maybe, just maybe, he'd come around. She didn't realize that Donovan wasn't coming to talk. He was coming with a plan. Setting the stage. Florida, late evening. The Florida air was warm in that sticky, heavy way that clings to your skin. Streetlights hummed. Parking lots stretched wide and empty. This was the kind of night where nothing dramatic should happen. People should be going home, laughing with friends, eating late dinners, falling asleep with the TV on. But Kaylin got into her car, brushed a hand across her belly, and whispered, "It's okay. Mommy's here." Then she drove to the meeting spot. Maybe he's finally ready to talk. Maybe he realized I'm not trying to trap him. Maybe he'll just understand. I don't want to fight. I just want peace. I want him to know our son deserves a chance. I hope tonight goes well. Please, please let it go well. She parked in a dimly lit area, halfway between tension and hope. Not quite a safe space, not quite dangerous. Just neutral. A few minutes later, another car pulled in. It was Donovan. He stepped out, hood over his head, shoulders stiff. Not hesitating, not nervous. Just cold. Kaylin didn't see that. She saw someone she used to care about. Someone she kept trying to believe had goodness left in him. She didn't see the calculation in his eyes, the weight of the decision he'd already made. She wasn't supposed to see it, not until it was too late. This is how tragedies like this start, with one person believing there's still hope, and the other quietly deciding someone doesn't deserve to exist. Kaylin's story didn't begin in that parking lot. It began long before, in the small moments, the ignored red flags, the subtle cruelties, the messages dripping with resentment. And this is where we begin unraveling them. Because before vengeance arrived, before justice cracked down like thunder, before the world knew what he'd done, Kaylin was already fighting a battle she didn't even realize had started. Before the parking lot, before the text sharpened into threats, before the night air carried the scent of betrayal and violence, there were moments that made everything seem deceptively normal. Moments that tricked everyone, friends, family, even Kaylin herself, into thinking Donovan was just another complicated boy trying to find his way in a world that often chewed young men up before they ever found solid ground. When Kaylin first met him, she was drawn to the contrast he presented. The quiet confidence, the guarded smile, the way he looked at her like she was the one steady thing in a life full of noise. He knew how to be charming when he wanted to be. He knew how to be gentle in ways that could disarm even the most cautious heart. And Kaylin, still young but already carrying an emotional maturity that made her seem older than her years, saw the softness he showed her and believed it. Believed him. Believed the things he whispered to her in late-night conversations, the promises he made when the world felt still and the future seemed wide enough for both of them to fit comfortably inside it. But relationships don't turn toxic in a day. They rot slowly, starting with tiny cuts that barely sting until suddenly the wound is too deep to ignore. For Kaylin, the first signs of Donovan's possessiveness seemed almost flattering, how he always wanted to know where she was, who she was talking to, when she'd be home. At first, it felt like attentiveness, that intense interest some boys show when they're terrified of losing someone who matters to them. Yet gradually, the questions sharpened into interrogations, harmless concerns solidified into restrictions, and what once felt like affection began morphing into a cage built from insecurity and control. And Kaylin, raised with a hopeful heart and taught to give people grace, kept excusing the behavior. "He just cares," she'd say. "He's been through a lot. He's scared. He didn't mean it that way." That's the trap so many fall into, not realizing the difference between love and ownership until it's too late. Meanwhile, Donovan's internal world was darkening in ways that even the people closest to him couldn't fully perceive. To most on the outside, he seemed like any other young man trying, sometimes failing, to carve out his identity. But inside his mind, small frustrations festered into resentments. And those resentments fed a growing belief that he deserved control over the things that scared him, that he had a right to shape the world the way he wanted it. Long before Kaylin ever told him she was pregnant, fragments of narcissistic entitlement and deep-rooted insecurity were already clashing violently beneath the surface. He didn't know how to be vulnerable without feeling weak, didn't know how to lose control without becoming dangerous. And when someone like that faces a situation they cannot manipulate, like unexpected parenthood, the explosion becomes almost inevitable. To Kaylin, the pregnancy wasn't a devastating blow. It was a complicated blessing, a terrifying but profound shift in her life that she chose to embrace with courage far beyond her age. She spent nights lying awake with a hand resting protectively over her belly, imagining the future, imagining the tiny human growing inside her, imagining herself pushing a stroller, rocking him to sleep, teaching him his first words. She called him her little fighter, whispering promises in the quiet moments when nobody else could hear. She worried about finances, worried about school, worried about her changing body, but she did not worry about loving him. That part came naturally, instinctively, with a ferocity she didn't fully recognize in herself until the moment she learned she was not just living for one life anymore, but for two. But Donovan saw the pregnancy differently. To him, it wasn't an expansion of possibility, it was a closing door, a trap, a burden tied around his future. He believed it would ruin his plans, derail his ambitions, chain him to responsibilities he had no intention of carrying. And because he lacked the emotional maturity to take accountability, he blamed Kaylin. The resentment grew quickly, fueled by his need for control and his terror of losing it. He saw her as the obstacle, not the mother of his child. He saw the baby as a mistake, not a human being. And in the deep, twisted corners of his mind, he began rewriting the narrative. She was doing this to him. She was trying to trap him. She was the enemy. Kaylin sensed the shift but couldn't pinpoint its depth. She saw the messages grow colder, the tone sharper, the affection fading into hostility. She found herself rereading old conversations, wondering what had changed, wondering where she had gone wrong. She tried to reassure him, tried to bridge the widening space between them, tried to show him that the baby was not a punishment, but a person worthy of love. Yet every attempt she made was swallowed by his bitterness. Through it all, she refused to consider abortion. It wasn't an option in her heart. She had already fallen in love with her son long before she ever felt him kick. Meanwhile, the people in Kaylin's life noticed the tension more than she realized. Her mother saw it in the long silences during phone calls, in the way Kaylin's smile didn't reach her eyes when Donovan's name came up. Her friends saw it in the anxious glances toward her phone whenever a text came in. Her closest cousin saw it in the exhaustion buried beneath Kaylin's attempts to stay optimistic. And though they tried to warn her, tried to make her see that the affection she once had for Donovan had been replaced by control, Kaylin believed, like so many young girls do, that things could still get better. She believed she could fix it, or at least survive it. But while Kaylin was clinging to hope, Donovan was drifting further into the shadows of his own mind. He began forming dark ideas about how to escape the situation entirely. He began imagining alternatives, methods, outcomes. He researched. He brooded. He talked to no one, letting his own thoughts echo in the empty chambers of his conscience until they no longer sounded monstrous to him. They sounded practical, logical, necessary. Yet for all the darkness brewing in him, the world outside continued moving as if nothing was wrong. People went to work, children played in parks, families ate dinner together, and the police patrolled the streets unaware that a storm was quietly forming in the life of a girl they had never met. Inside the police department, officers wrote reports, sorted through calls, dealt with the daily chaos of crime that never seemed to pause. None of them knew that soon they would be piecing together one of the most chilling cases their community had seen in years. None of them realized that a young life carrying another life, was moving steadily toward an irreversible collision with violence. The day before she disappeared, Kaylin had a long conversation with her mother. She talked about feeling nervous but hopeful, about wanting Donovan to finally hear her out. She said she didn't want the baby to grow up with a father who hated him, that she wished Donovan would see the situation differently. Her mother listened, heart aching with the helplessness only a parent can know, wanting to save her daughter from heartbreak, but unable to shield her from the world's cruelty. She urged Kaylin to be careful, to meet Donovan in public spaces, to trust her instincts. Kaylin agreed. She always did. But hope makes people believe danger can be negotiated with. Kaylin's last text to her cousin said she was just going to talk things out and that she'd be home afterward. She included a little heart emoji at the end, as if her optimism could rewrite reality. Meanwhile, Donovan sent messages that painted a very different picture. He simmered with rage that bordered on obsession, telling friends he felt set up and tricked, messaging Kaylin with words dripping in resentment, hinting that he was ready to fix everything in ways she didn't fully understand. To the trained eye, these messages would later be revealed as clear indicators of premeditation, digital fingerprints of a crime committed long before the physical act. As the hours stretched toward the night they would meet, the paths of their lives, one filled with hope, the other with hatred, moved silently toward a point of impact. Kaylin carried love in her belly. Donovan carried murder in his mind. And neither of them knew that in less than 24 hours, their fates would converge in a parking lot that would become the last place Kaylin ever breathed. The night that would reshape everything began in a way that was almost painfully ordinary. The kind of quiet evening Florida often gave its residents a humid warmth that clung to the skin. The faint hum of cicadas pulsing like a tired heartbeat in the background, and the soft glow of streetlights stretching across empty stretches of asphalt. Nothing about the air suggested danger. Nothing warned the world that it was about to lose a girl who had done nothing but choose life for herself and her unborn son. Kaylin didn't dress dramatically for the meeting, didn't treat it like a confrontation or a battlefield. She wore something comfortable, something she had worn before without a second thought, and she moved through her room with the slow, thoughtful deliberation of someone trying to convince herself that the night would end with a sense of closure. She felt the faint stirring beneath her ribs, placed a hand over her belly, and whispered words she didn't fully understand would be her last. "We'll be okay. I promise." Her mother watched her from the doorway, leaning on the frame with that quiet, knowing concern that mothers feel long before trouble arrives. She didn't like this meeting. Didn't trust the tone of Donovan's recent messages. Didn't like how Kaylin's voice got tighter every time she said his name. But she also knew the futility of forbidding an 18-year-old from seeking answers, especially when those answers could shape the future of the child she was carrying. She tried to offer reassurance, tried to tuck fear behind soft, supportive words, but it came out as a pleading suggestion. "Please don't stay out late. And text me if anything feels wrong." Kaylin, with the naive confidence of someone who still believed she had more time, smiled, nodded, and promised she would. Promises like that always feel small until you realize they were the last ones ever made. On the other side of town, Donovan was submerged in a completely different emotional world, one devoid of the warmth or hope that guided Kaylin. His room felt colder, though the temperature was no different. He moved through it not with nervousness, but with the eerie calm of someone who had reached a decision long before the night had even begun. His mind wasn't circling possibilities anymore. It was focused, locked in, sharpened into a single chilling point. The messages he had been sending throughout the week had slowly escalated from frustration to disdain, from disdain to anger, and from anger to something more sinister. He had allowed the resentment to ferment into a twisted narrative where he was the victim and Kaylin the villain. In his head, every imagined slight was justification, every disagreement an attack, Every choice she made without his approval an unforgivable betrayal. And now she was carrying proof of that betrayal inside her. He didn't leave his house as someone heading to a conversation. He left as someone heading to a predetermined outcome. Kaylin's drive to the meeting was long enough for doubt to arise, but short enough for her to quiet it before it grew too loud. She kept both hands on the steering wheel as she navigated the dimly lit streets, feeling strangely exposed yet determined to stay calm. She repeated in her mind, over and over, that this was just a conversation, closure, something that would help her move forward, whether with Donovan or without him. She thought about the future apartment she wanted to find, the baby clothes she had bookmarked on her phone, the ultrasound picture folded neatly in her bag like a tiny talisman. She wondered if Donovan would soften once the baby was born, if holding his son might unlock something human in him. She hoped. Hope is often a quiet, stubborn thing. Meanwhile, Donovan's drive was layered with something far darker. The streetlights smeared across his windshield as he moved through the night like a shadow wearing skin. His thoughts churned steadily, no longer chaotic but disturbingly organized. He replayed the arguments, the refusals, the moments Kaylin had held her ground instead of bending to his will. Each memory twisted into fuel. He felt powerful in his anger, righteous even, as if the universe had wronged him through her. He gripped the steering wheel hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the skin. Every turn in the road brought him closer to the moment he had spent hours replaying in his mind, not with dread, but with the cold acceptance of someone who believed they were correcting a mistake. When Kaylin pulled into the parking lot, it was emptier than she expected. The wide stretches of asphalt reflected the yellow streetlights above, forming long, distorted shadows that reached out like fingers. She chose a spot not too far from the main road, a place where she thought she would be visible enough to be safe, but private enough to talk. She didn't want drama or confrontation. She wanted calm, clarity, maybe even closure. She placed her hands on her belly again, feeling a tender nudge that made her heart swell with that familiar mix of love and responsibility. Then she saw Donovan's car pull in and felt a flicker of relief mixed with unease she couldn't fully name. Donovan exited his vehicle with none of the hesitation one might expect from someone about to face the mother of his child. His movements were deliberate, controlled, distantly focused, as if he had rehearsed each step in his head. The hood of his sweatshirt cast a shadow across his face, making him look like a stranger wearing the memories of a boy Kaylin once trusted. When he approached her car, Kaylin lowered her window slightly, offering a gentle greeting she hoped might thaw some of the tension. His response was clipped, emotionless, more a sound than a sentiment. She felt the first true shiver of fear, then a small, instinctive tremor that whispered something wasn't right. Their conversation didn't unfold in dramatic shouts or violent words. It was quieter than that, which somehow made it worse. Donovan's voice carried the coldness of someone already detached from the humanity of the person in front of him. He didn't ask about the baby. He didn't express concern. He didn't speak like a young father confronting a life-altering situation. Instead, he spoke in tones of accusation, bitterness, and entitlement. He demanded explanations for choices she had every right to make. He insisted she had done this to him, that she had trapped him, that she was destroying his life. Kaylin tried desperately to explain, to soothe, to remind him that she wasn't his enemy, that this was their child. But every word she spoke rolled off him like water on stone. His eyes were flat, unreadable, stripped of any warmth she once knew. In the last moments before the violence, Kaylin had a thought she didn't expect. He doesn't see me anymore. It wasn't fear of death that filled her. It was the heartbreak of realizing she was standing in front of a person who once held her close, and he now looked at her as if she were nothing. The moment Donovan chose violence was not loud or dramatic. It was quick, decisive, and horrifyingly silent. A shift in posture. A reach into his clothes. A flash of something metallic or dark. Kaylin didn't even have time to scream before the world collapsed into panic and pain. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had imagined about her son's future, every dream she still carried shrank into a split second of terror. The unborn child she had promised to protect never knew what happened. Kaylin's final thoughts were not of anger or hatred. They were instinctive, primal, anchored in fear and the desperate, aching desire to survive for her child's sake. The night swallowed her life with a brutality that no one saw. As Donovan left the scene, he didn't run. He didn't stumble or panic. He moved with the same eerie calm he had arrived with, as if he had simply completed a task. His car blended back onto the road, disappearing into the same darkness that had concealed his intention. And in that moment, the world did what it always does when tragedy strikes. It kept turning, unaware that it had just lost a girl who should have seen a sunrise. Back at home, the first sign that something was wrong came in the form of silence. Kaylin's mother waited longer than she should have before checking her phone, expecting to see a message from her daughter, something short but reassuring. When she saw nothing, she felt the first crack of panic bloom in her chest. She called Kaylin. No answer. Texted. No reply. At first, she told herself her daughter was still talking to Donovan, that the conversation might be stretching longer than expected. But as minutes turned into an hour, and an hour began pressing against midnight, worry grew into dread. When she finally called the police to report her daughter missing, her voice shook with the fear of a mother who already suspected something terrible had happened, even if she couldn't articulate it. The officers who took the initial report treated it with the routine professionalism that missing person cases often receive in the first few hours. They asked questions: when was she last seen, what car she was driving, what she was wearing, where she went, who she was meeting. They typed notes into their system, unaware that they were documenting the earliest stage of a case that would soon send shockwaves across the community. Inside the police station, the night shift moved steadily. Officers filed reports, answered calls, responded to disturbances. No one knew yet. No one understood that the phone call from a worried mother was the first thread of a story that would unravel into horror. But as the first hours passed and Kaylin's phone remained silent, and Donovan's story failed to align with the facts the officers began gathering, the investigation slowly began shifting from routine to urgent. The world, unaware of the tragedy that unfolded in a quiet parking lot, slept through the night. But for Kaylin's family, for the officers beginning to sense something profoundly wrong, and for the silent universe that had just absorbed the extinguishing of two innocent lives, nothing would ever be ordinary again. For weeks, Kaylin had tried to convince herself that Donovan's coldness was temporary, that the man who once held her face in his hands with that quiet, protective tenderness hadn't completely vanished. She wanted to believe that the late-night silences, the sudden outbursts, and the way his eyes avoided her stomach were all just symptoms of panic, not cruelty. But by the time November's humidity began clinging to the windows like a warning, she could feel something shifting in him, something heavy, dark, and calculated. His mask, the one he wore so arrogantly when family members or neighbors asked about the pregnancy, had begun to crack. It wasn't dramatic or loud at first. It was subtle, like hairline fractures under glossy paint. She caught it in the stiffness of his smile, in the mechanical way he hugged her, in the sharpness of every exhale he gave whenever she mentioned doctor's appointments or baby kicks. It was all there if she looked closely. But denial is a powerful drug, and for a while she clung to it like a life raft. The first real break in his facade came on a muggy Wednesday night, the kind where Florida's air feels thick enough to swallow. Kaylin had been scrolling through baby clothes on her phone, laughing at a tiny pair of dinosaur pajamas, when she heard his footsteps pacing in the living room. They were too heavy, too fast. She called his name gently, hoping he might open up about whatever storm was brewing in his chest. Instead, He turned toward her with an expression so hollow it didn't look like the face of someone she knew. His eyes, once so warm, carried a kind of electric fury inside them, like he was one argument away from breaking something. For the first time, she felt her heartbeat run faster, not from anxiety, but from instinct. Something in her body whispered, "Pay attention." Donovan didn't sit beside her that night. He didn't touch her stomach or ask how she was feeling. He stood near the doorway, arms crossed tightly, as if barricading himself behind his own anger. When she tried to show him the embroidered pajamas she found online, hoping it might reignite even a spark of joy, he didn't even glance at the screen. He only muttered, "We wouldn't even be looking at that if you just listened the first time." She felt the air leave her lungs. It wasn't the first time he'd said something cruel, but this time his tone felt heavier, devoid of frustration and full of resentment. There was something final in the way he looked at her, something that told her he had crossed a line internally, even if he hadn't said it out loud yet. But Kaylin had always been gentle, hopeful, forgiving to a fault. She tried to reason with him, tried to soften her voice, to remind him they were in this together. She told him the baby deserved to live, deserved to be loved, and that he didn't have to be afraid. She offered him every reassurance she could think of, even though his anger made her hands tremble. But Donovan didn't want reassurance. He wanted compliance. He wanted control. When she refused to hide her growing belly under oversized clothes just to keep things easy, he accused her of trying to trap him. When she explained that she didn't want to abort their son, he dismissed her with a glare that shook her to her core. She felt as though her very existence had become an inconvenience to him, and his coldness was no longer something she could explain away as stress or confusion. It was intentional. And then came the night she saw the text message, the one that, in hindsight, would haunt her family forever. She had reached for his phone innocently, intending to order dinner, and the screen lit up before she even touched it. One line glowed against the darkness, sent by Donovan himself in a group chat he thought she'd never discover. "I'm gonna crop her out." Kaylin froze. The words didn't feel like a metaphor. They felt literal, violent, final. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, her pulse hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Her first instinct was to confront him, to demand an explanation, but when she imagined the look he would give her, cold, dismissive, maybe even furious, her courage withered. Instead, she set his phone down quietly, as if afraid it might shatter from the weight of what she just read, and retreated into the bathroom where she cried silently into her palms. That moment became the turning point, the quiet, devastating moment where she realized love wasn't enough to save someone determined to destroy themselves. She didn't know what to do next. Should she tell her mother? Should she leave him right away? Should she confront him? Fear clouded her judgment, wrapping itself around her thoughts like smoke, blurring the edges of reason. She was 18, pregnant, vulnerable, and deeply in love with a man who had already decided she was disposable. The worst part was that she still wanted to believe he might change, might become the man she first fell for, the one who whispered dreams into her hair during long drives and told her they would build a family someday. But someday had come sooner than he wanted, and instead of rising to meet it, he tried to erase it. By the end of that week, the crack in Donovan's mask was no longer a crack. It was a gaping fracture, wide and ugly enough for anyone to see, anyone except the girl still trying to convince herself she didn't have a reason to be afraid. Kaylin carried their son beneath her heart with a tenderness he would never understand. She rested her palm on her stomach sometimes as she lay awake at night, trying to soothe not the baby, but herself. She told her son she loved him, told him she'd protect him, even though deep down she feared she was losing the ability to protect herself. She felt the walls closing in, the tension stretching tighter with every passing day, but she kept moving forward with a bravery she didn't acknowledge, because survival doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like trying to make it to tomorrow. She didn't know Donovan had already made a decision. She only sensed the danger in the way he studied her now, as if memorizing her, evaluating her, rather than loving her. His silence turned predatory. His presence felt heavier, darker, more suffocating. Every time he called her name, she flinched before she answered. Every time he walked into a room, she felt her muscles tighten. She didn't say it aloud, but her body knew. Their home was no longer a place of safety. It was a countdown. And the man she thought she would share her life with had already begun imagining a future where she never existed. The evening that marked the beginning of the end didn't announce itself with loud warnings or dramatic chaos. It arrived quietly, slipping into Kaylin's life like a humid gust of Florida air pushing against the window screens. There was nothing outwardly unusual about that Thursday, nothing that would have made her mother pause or cause the neighbors to sense trouble brewing. But sometimes tragedies aren't born from storms. Sometimes they grow slowly, silently, like roots spreading beneath the soil, settling deeper until they're impossible to pull out. And on that night, the roots of Donovan's cruelty finally broke the surface. Kaylin had spent most of the day feeling physically drained, the kind of exhaustion that settles into a pregnant woman's bones, weighing down her limbs until even the act of standing feels like wading through thick water. She spent the late afternoon on her bed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, tracing idle circles as she watched the ceiling fan spin overhead. Her mind wandered the way it often did nowadays, dreaming of her baby's first cry, imagining tiny fingers curling around hers, wondering what his eyes would look like. The pure, uncomplicated joy of those thoughts always brought her comfort, a soft glow that warmed her from the inside. But tonight, even the glow couldn't fully reach her. Something felt off, heavy, wrong. She glanced at her phone for what must have been the 10th time, waiting for Donovan to check in, to ask how she was feeling, to show some sign, any sign, that he cared about her or their son. But the screen remained cold and empty. The last message she'd sent him, a simple "How's your day?" had been delivered hours ago and left unanswered. Her stomach tightened, not the baby, but anxiety. She remembered the text she'd seen days earlier, the chilling promise he made to someone else. "I'm gonna crop her out." Those 4 words had burrowed into her mind like splinters, sharp and impossible to ignore. She kept trying to convince herself he didn't mean it literally, or that he said it out of anger, not intention. But her instincts whispered a different truth, one she wasn't ready to face. As the sky darkened, she forced herself out of bed and into the kitchen to prepare something light to eat. The house was quiet, too quiet, and every small sound, the click of the refrigerator door, the hum of the microwave felt unnaturally loud. When her phone finally buzzed, the sound startled her so badly she nearly dropped the glass she was holding. She grabbed the phone with shaking hands, her heart lifting with a fragment of hope that maybe, just maybe, Donovan was reaching out with softness, with remorse, with anything resembling the man she used to know. But when she opened the message, the hope drained from her body like water through broken glass. "Meet me tonight. We need to talk." No apology, no warmth, no sign of concern for her or the baby, just a demand sharp, clipped cold. The kind of message that didn't extend an invitation but issued a command. Something in her chest tightened painfully. She read it again, then again, trying to decode the tone behind the words. But the truth was unavoidable. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted control. And she felt an unexplainable dread curl at the edges of her consciousness. She typed a cautious reply, fingers trembling slightly. "About what?" His response came almost instantly, as if he'd been staring at his screen waiting for her to answer. "Just come out. Don't make this difficult." A chill crept across her skin, prickling the back of her neck. That phrasing, she'd heard it before, during arguments when he wanted to force her into agreeing with something she knew wasn't right. Donovan had a way of weaponizing his calmness, speaking with a tone so deceptively steady it sent warning signals through her body. And now, reading those words, she felt her heartbeat thudding heavily against her ribs. The baby shifted inside her, a small movement that made her catch her breath. She whispered a soft apology to her son, as if he could sense her fear. Part of her wanted to ignore the message entirely, to stay home, lock the doors, and pretend she never saw it. But another part, the hopeful, forgiving girl who still wanted to believe Donovan wasn't capable of something truly monstrous, clung to the idea that maybe he really did want to talk things out. Maybe this was the breakthrough. Maybe the man she loved was finally ready to step up. The tug-of-war inside her intensified, leaving her dizzy and torn. Her mother noticed her pacing and asked gently if everything was okay, but Kaylin forced a smile, pretending she wasn't unraveling inside. She didn't want to worry her. She didn't want to admit that the father of her child had become someone she didn't fully recognize. So she put on a brave face, told her mother she'd be back soon, and grabbed her keys. Her hand lingered on the doorknob longer than usual, her mind begging her to stay inside. But a deeper part of her, the part shaped by loyalty and love, pushed her out the door. The night air was thick and warm as she stepped outside, the cicadas buzzing like a low warning chorus. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and with each step toward her car, she felt the dread tightening around her like invisible wires. She paused before getting in, one hand instinctively rubbing her stomach, whispering softly to her unborn son as if trying to reassure him. "It's just a talk," she told herself out loud. "He just wants to talk." But even as she said the words, her voice trembled. The car engine hummed to life, and as she pulled onto the road, the street stretched out ahead of her, silent, deserted, and unforgiving. Her headlights carved through the darkness, but no matter how far they reached, they never seemed to illuminate the uneasy feeling gnawing at the back of her mind. She felt as if she were driving deeper into a void, one where familiar landmarks blurred and the air felt colder with every passing minute. And somewhere, miles away, Donovan was waiting. Not with love, not with remorse, but with a decision already made. And Kaylin, still hopeful, still trusting, still believing there was something worth saving, was heading straight toward him. The road unspooled beneath Kaylin's tires like a dark ribbon, stretching endlessly into a night that felt too quiet, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her hands gripped the steering wheel with more force than she realized, knuckles pale under the glowing dashboard lights. The hum of the engine was steady, but beneath it, her heartbeat thudded a frantic, unsteady rhythm. She kept glancing at her phone on the passenger seat, half expecting Donovan to message again, maybe to soften his earlier tone, maybe to show even a shred of warmth. But the screen remained stubbornly blank, its cold silence echoing the terrifying possibility she refused to voice, that this meeting wasn't about reconciliation, but about conclusion. She tried to steady her breathing, inhaling slowly the way her mother always taught her whenever anxiety hit too hard. But the air seemed to stick in her throat, refusing to move freely. Every inhale was shallow, shaky. Every exhale sounded like a plea. The streetlights cast fleeting shadows across her face, each flash illuminating the worry etched into her features. She looked younger than 18 in that moment, fragile, hopeful, scared. Still a girl, yet already a mother, carrying the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders as she drove toward someone who saw those lives as a burden. As she turned onto the stretch of road leading into Donovan's neighborhood, her mind drifted through memories she didn't mean to revisit. She remembered the first time he kissed her, the way he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his eyes soft and full of promise. She remembered late-night drives where he'd sing off-key just to make her laugh. She remembered how he held her the day she told him she was pregnant, how he froze not with joy, but shock, and how she'd convinced herself that given time, he'd warm to the idea. She remembered the good moments, yes. But now, They felt like distant shadows, fragile echoes overwhelmed by the growing storm inside him. Her phone buzzed suddenly, jolting her so hard she nearly swerved. She snatched it quickly, hoping foolishly that he was calling to say he was sorry. But her face fell when she saw the notification wasn't from Donovan at all. It was from her mother. "Drive safe, honey. Text me when you get there." Tears pricked the back of her eyes. Not from sadness, but from the crushing weight of gratitude and fear intertwined. Her mother's love was simple, pure, unwavering, everything Donovan's had ceased to be. For a brief moment, Kaylin considered turning around, going back home, confessing everything she'd been holding inside. But fear of confrontation, fear of his anger, pushed her forward. She didn't want to be dramatic. She didn't want to cause trouble. She didn't want to believe the worst. That kindness, that softness inside her heart, one of her greatest qualities, was also the very thing that left her vulnerable to the danger waiting ahead. As she approached the meeting spot he'd chosen, she realized it wasn't somewhere they usually went. It wasn't a park they'd visited or a quiet street they'd used to talk things through. It was an isolated lot behind a row of old, unused buildings, a place where broken streetlights flickered with an unsettling rhythm. Kaylin slowed the car, unease prickling across her skin like tiny electric shocks. Why here? Why not somewhere familiar? Why not somewhere safe? Her headlights washed over the cracked asphalt, revealing scattered debris and the silhouettes of weeds growing through neglected concrete. The place felt abandoned, forgotten, void of life. She tightened her grip on the wheel, instinct screaming at her to leave. But then she saw his car parked in the far corner, its dark outline barely visible in the dim glow of a failing overhead lamp. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Her heart pounded so violently she felt it in her fingertips. She whispered to herself, voice trembling, "It's okay, it's just a talk. It's fine. It's fine." But reassurance couldn't override instinct, and every cell in her body was alert, taut with dread. She parked a few feet away, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. Silence wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. She watched Donovan sitting in his car, his posture unreadable in the darkness. He didn't get out. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge her presence at all. He just sat there, motionless, as if waiting for her to approach him first. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The air felt heavier, thicker, weighted with something she couldn't quite identify but instinctively feared. Her stomach tightened, not from the baby's movement this time, but from the looming sense of danger. Still, she forced herself to move. She reminded herself that she loved him, that love required patience and communication, even when things were hard. She told herself he wasn't a monster, just scared, overwhelmed, confused. She opened the door slowly, stepping out into the night air. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face, and she tucked it behind her ear out of habit, her breath unsteady. The ground felt uneven beneath her feet as she walked toward his car. Each step sounded too loud, echoing off the empty buildings around her. Donovan finally opened his door, stepping out slowly. The dim light cast a harsh shadow across his face, making it difficult to read his expression. But his posture rigid, tense, distant made her heart drop. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say it back. He didn't smile. He didn't ask how she was. He only stared at her stomach, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing with something far darker than frustration. And that was the moment, small, quiet, devastating, when Kaylin finally understood that the person standing in front of her was no longer the boy she loved. This was someone else. Someone colder. Someone capable of cruelty she had never imagined. Her pulse quickened, her breath caught, and a shiver crawled up her spine as Donovan took a step toward her. The night around them seemed to lean in, listening, watching, waiting. And deep in her heart, Kaylin felt the terrifying realization settle like a stone. This wasn't a conversation. This was a crossroads. And only one of them would walk away from it. Kaylin stood a few feet away from Donovan, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if he could hear it echoing through the empty lot. The distance between them wasn't far, yet it felt impossibly wide, like a chasm carved by months of unspoken resentment, fear, and betrayal. She searched his face for some sign of softness, some trace of the boy she once trusted with everything. But the expression staring back at her wasn't love or worry or even frustration. It was something colder, sharper, harder. A mixture of bitterness and entitlement, wrapped together with a hostility that made her instincts scream. The street lamp flickered above them, casting intermittent shadows across his face. In one moment he looked normal, just a young man overwhelmed by choices, and in the next he looked almost unrecognizable, like a stranger wearing a mask of who he used to be. His eyes, once warm and full of plans, now held a chilling emptiness. It wasn't the look of someone who wanted to talk. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind long before she arrived. "You came," Donovan said finally, breaking the suffocating silence. His voice was flat, emotionless. It didn't sound like a greeting. It sounded like an accusation. Kaylin swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "You told me we needed to talk." He let out a breath, not a sigh, but something colder, like he was annoyed she needed clarification. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and she tried not to flinch. She folded her hands over her stomach instinctively, a protective gesture she wasn't even consciously aware of. "There shouldn't have been anything to talk about," he muttered, eyes fixed not on her face but on her belly. "You made this way more complicated than it had to be." She felt her heart drop, a physical ache radiating through her chest. "Complicated?" She repeated softly, her voice trembling. "Donovan, this is our child." His jaw clenched. "I didn't want a kid, Kaylin." "How many times do you want me to say it?" Her breath shook. She had heard those words before, but tonight they felt heavier, more dangerous. "I know you're scared," she said gently. "I know this wasn't what you planned, but I'm scared too. I'm doing this alone, and I needed you." He cut her off abruptly. "I didn't ask you to keep it." Those 7 words hit her like a punch to the chest. She staggered back a step, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. "You can't talk about a baby like that," she whispered. "He's not a mistake. He's not a burden. He's—" "Stop." His voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough to silence her instantly. The harshness in his tone made her breath catch. Donovan had raised his voice before, but tonight there was something different in it, something that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. "Just stop trying to make this something it's not." Kaylin's hands trembled where they rested on her stomach. "Why are you talking to me like this?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. "What did I do to make you hate me so much?" For a moment, a flicker of emotion flashed across his face, something dark, something conflicted, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. His eyes hardened. "You trapped me," he hissed. "You ruined everything. You think I want to be tied down at 23? You think I want to be stuck with you and some kid for the rest of my life?" Her breath hitched painfully. "I didn't trap you," she said, voice cracking. "I thought we were in this together. I thought—" "You loved me." "I did," he said, and the coldness in his voice made the words sound like a lie. "Until you forced this on me." Silence fell between them, again heavy, suffocating, final. Kaylin felt something inside her break. Not loudly, not with anger or rage, but quietly, like a small object dropped from a great height, shattering upon impact. She looked at him, not the boy she loved, but the man standing before her, and understood, with devastating clarity, that there was no saving this. No conversation that could fix what had already been fractured beyond repair. The child inside her shifted again, and she felt a wave of protectiveness wash over her, stronger than her fear. "I'm not killing my baby," she said softly but firmly. "I'm not doing that. I won't." Her refusal hung in the air like a spark near gasoline. Donovan's expression changed, a subtle shift, barely noticeable to the untrained eye, but to Kaylin it was unmistakable. His gaze darkened, his jaw tightened, and his posture shifted ever so slightly, as if bracing himself for an outcome he'd already decided on. Something primal inside her screamed run, but her feet remained frozen. And then, slowly, he stepped even closer. "You should have listened," he whispered, voice low and chilling. Kaylin backed away instinctively, her breath coming faster now. "Donovan, what do you mean? What are you doing?" But he didn't answer, not directly, not with words. Instead, he reached into his jacket in a slow, deliberate motion that made her blood run cold. Her body reacted before her mind did, her pulse spiking, panic flooding through her veins like ice. She shook her head, tears spilling over now, her voice trembling so violently she could barely speak. "Don't," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Please, please, don't do anything stupid." He didn't look conflicted. He didn't look afraid. He looked resigned, as if he had already crossed a line long before she arrived. A line she didn't even know existed. A line she could not bring him back from. The night around them seemed to still, the air thick with the weight of his decision. The world felt suspended, like time was holding its breath. Kaylin realized in that moment too late that Donovan wasn't negotiating. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't reconsidering. He was finishing something. And as he took one more step toward her, she felt her heart splinter into 1,000 terrified pieces, because she finally saw the truth in his eyes. He had come there to end something, and she was standing in its way. By the time midnight seeped into the narrow cracks of the city, the investigation had already begun to feel less like a pursuit and more like a slow descent into a labyrinth that breathed on its own. The walls inside the abandoned facility were thick with silence, an unnerving kind of quiet that didn't simply rest, but waited as though expecting something or someone to provoke it. As the dim beam of the flashlight cut across the peeling paint and rust-coated metal, it became painfully clear that this place had been left behind long before any official record claimed it was shut down. The walls weren't dead. They were listening, holding secrets that had soaked into them over years of neglect and unspoken atrocities. Every step echoed too loudly, bouncing back with a distorted delay, almost mocking, as though the building had grown tired of keeping its silence and was starting to whisper back. The deeper we walked, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing itself against our lungs as if discouraging us from moving further. Dust floated in the narrow strips of light like restless particles trapped in time, and somewhere in the distance a metallic clatter reverberated through the hallways. At first, it seemed like the echo of our own footsteps, but then it repeated, too sharp, too intentional, too heavy to be an accident. It didn't match our rhythm. Someone or something was responding. The shadows stretched unnaturally long across the concrete floor, bending and merging as if the building itself were rearranging their shapes to mislead us. The place felt alive, not in a paranormal way, but in the way that trauma can linger long after the last witness is gone, turning the memory of suffering into a living organism that refuses to die. It was when we reached the central chamber that the true weight of the location settled onto our shoulders. The room opened like a scar, wide and raw, with markings on the floor that didn't match any blueprint the department had on file. Symbols scratched, not drawn, covered the ground in jagged circles, and scattered around were remnants of things that once belonged to people. A child's metal hair clip, a torn jacket sleeve, a cracked pair of glasses whose lenses reflected our movements like blinking eyes. The temperature here dropped sharply, not with the cold of nature, but the cold of something deliberately preserved, like an emotion frozen in place, refusing to melt with time. Nothing about this chamber aligned with the facility's supposed function, and every instinct screamed that this room had witnessed acts meant never to be uncovered. But the worst part wasn't what lay on the floor, it was what remained on the walls. Scratches. Deep, frantic scratches etched into the concrete by human hands. Some were small, some were long, some overlapped, carving chaotic patterns that spoke louder than any document or testimony ever could. Whatever happened here, it wasn't quiet. It wasn't humane. And it certainly wasn't abandoned peacefully. The closer we inspected, the more we noticed that some scratches weren't random. They formed words, fragmented phrases, desperate pleas carved with the final shreds of strength someone possessed. "Don't come back," one message read. Another, barely visible but unmistakably human, said, "They watch." A chill ran through us, not because of what we read, but because of the sinking realization that these warnings weren't meant for the world outside, they were meant for anyone who dared follow the same path we had taken tonight. The walls weren't simply listening, they were remembering, repeating, and warning. And as the faint echo of that metallic clatter returned once more closer this time, it became impossible not to wonder whether the building's last residents had ever truly left, or whether their presence still lingered in the form of something watching from the shadows. The silence that followed felt strangely deliberate, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to acknowledge the sound we all wished we hadn't heard. For a moment, no one moved, not because we chose to freeze, but because something deep in our instincts commanded us to. The beam of the flashlight hovered in the empty space ahead, trembling slightly in the grip that suddenly felt too weak to be trusted. The metallic clatter had echoed through the halls like a warning knock, and even though we couldn't see anything, the sense of being watched slithered across our skin like invisible fingers. It wasn't paranoia. It was presence cold, observing patient. The kind that doesn't need to reveal itself to assert control. The kind that knows exactly where you are, even when you don't know where it is. As we turned toward the sound, the narrow hallway seemed to stretch farther than before, like the building had subtly rearranged itself when we weren't looking. The walls tightened, the ceiling dipped lower, and the strip of darkness at the end grew thicker, heavier, almost textured. The flashlight's beam flickered for the first time all night, not from low battery, but from something passing briefly in front of it, something that moved too silently to belong to any living creature. It didn't have form or mass or shape. It was more like a shift in the air, a disturbance you sense before you understand. And then, just as quickly, it was gone, leaving behind only a faint echo, like someone dragging their fingertips along the wall in an unhurried, almost curious motion. When we approached the doorway where the shadow had appeared, the air grew noticeably colder, dense enough to sting the skin. The faint smell of rust mixed with something bitter, something that wasn't there minutes ago. The doorframe itself looked gnawed, the paint stripped in jagged patches as though it had endured years of something clawing or scraping at it. But there were no animals here, no signs of forced entry, no footprints other than our own. Yet the floor carried a faint outline, a smudge, a drag mark, a dark streak that trailed inward like something had moved itself across the floor without lifting its weight. The streak wasn't fresh, but it wasn't ancient either. It lived in the space between the two as though it had been made recently or repeatedly. Inside the room, the darkness swallowed everything instantly. Light refused to travel as far as it should. Shadows clung to the corners like living organisms, and the air vibrated with a low hum, so faint it bordered on inaudible, yet so persistent it crawled into the back of your skull. The room felt wrong, architecturally impossible, too cold, too wide, too hollow. And then, as the beam swept across the far wall, something came into view. Not an object, more like a distortion, a human-shaped interruption in the air. A silhouette without substance. A figure that didn't move even though the edges of its form rippled slightly, like heat waves rising from asphalt. It didn't step forward. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence weighing on the room with a suffocating heaviness that felt older than the building itself. No one breathed, no one dared blink. Because whatever stood in that doorway wasn't a person. It wasn't a memory trapped in dust and darkness. It wasn't even an echo of the past. It was something else, something that had been waiting in this place far longer than any official record admitted. Something that had adapted to the silence, the shadows, and the forgotten screams carved into the concrete. And the worst part was the unmistakable truth settling with icy certainty in our chests. It hadn't appeared suddenly. It had been standing there the entire time, quietly watching, waiting for us to reach this exact moment. The walls had been listening, yes. But this was the thing they were listening for. The truth didn't arrive with a revelation or a scream or any cinematic display of terror. It arrived in the smallest way possible, through the sound of breathing, not ours, not human. A low, rhythmic draw of air that came from a place where nothing alive should have been able to stand. It seeped out of the far corner of the room, so softly at first that we confused it with the shifting of old pipes or the settling of dust. But gradually, with each passing second, it grew fuller, deeper, more deliberate. The kind of breath that had weight to it, like the lungs behind it were enormous and ancient and absolutely patient. Each inhale dragged the cold air inward, and each exhale pushed out a slow gust that carried the faint scent of damp earth, rusted metal, and something electric like the charged air before a lightning strike. You could feel that breath against your skin, subtle but undeniable, like a slow-moving fog curling around your ankles. The beam of the flashlight quivered as if the hand holding it had forgotten how to stay steady. What terrified me most wasn't the breathing. It was the timing of it. It hadn't begun when we arrived. It hadn't started when we entered the room. It began only after we acknowledged the figure in the doorway, as though our recognition had given it permission to occupy the space fully, to make itself known. And that meant it wasn't hiding out of fear. It was hiding out of strategy. It wanted to be acknowledged. It wanted us to see it, to sense it, to feel it closing in, inch by inch, as if drawing nearer with each breath. The room felt smaller now, shrinking inward like the darkness itself was compressing the air. The walls seemed to lean forward, and even the floor felt like it had softened beneath our feet, becoming subtly less solid. Then the figure moved, not a step, not a lunge, not even a turn. It shifted. The silhouette wavered like a fluttering sheet of smoke gently disturbed by a breeze. But there was no breeze in that room, not a whisper of air. The distortion pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat echoing through the shadows, and then elongated, stretching upward in an unnatural, fluid ascent that made the top of its head brush the ceiling. It should not have been able to grow. It should not have been able to change its shape or height or mass. Yet here it was, unfurling like it had been hunched all this time, waiting for us to come close enough. Something in the darkness above its head thickened, forming an even deeper patch of black that absorbed the weak light immediately, snuffing out details as quickly as the flashlight revealed them. When the breathing stopped, it didn't bring relief. It brought dread, because silence meant intention. Silence meant the next moment mattered. A tightness formed in the air, like a pressure drop before a storm, and the hair on every inch of my body stood on end simultaneously. The figure began to tilt, not bend, not lean, but tilt its entire form, angling slowly, impossibly, like a tree trunk caught in a gravity shift. It leaned toward us without taking a step, without making a sound, sliding forward at a degree no human body could maintain without crumpling. There were no footsteps, no scraping sounds, no displaced air rushing past us. Just the steady, unnatural glide of something that wasn't bound by physical rules. We collectively stumbled back, though none of us remembered deciding to move. Instinct ripped through our muscles, forcing our bodies to retreat. But the doorway behind us suddenly felt too narrow, like it had shrunk when the darkness stretched. Panic prickled in my chest, but fear wasn't the worst part. The worst part was its focus. Even without eyes, without a face, without any features at all, you could feel it locking onto you, on your heartbeat, your breath, the way your pulse stuttered at your throat. It wasn't curious. It wasn't territorial. It was studying us, mapping out the contours of our fear the way a predator tests the reactions of cornered prey. I don't know what compelled me to look down, maybe a subconscious tug of dread, maybe the instinctual desire to confirm my worst suspicion, but when I lowered my gaze to the floor beneath the figure, my entire body went cold. The drag mark we'd seen earlier, the dark streak smeared across the concrete like something heavy had been pulled, now led directly to the figure's feet. Or where its feet should have been, because the smear didn't stop at its base. It continued underneath it, disappearing into the hollow cavity where its legs should have existed. Like the trail didn't end at this entity, but originated from it. And that's when the truth landed with crushing clarity. Whatever this was, it didn't arrive here. It was born here. It had lived inside this building, inside these walls, inside the stories of screams and echoes and forgotten victims. It wasn't haunting the place. It was the place, its grief, its history, its violence, its hunger, an accumulation of everything left behind. A shape carved out of the darkness people never dared to face. The figure straightened suddenly, snapping upright with the fluidity of a shadow snapping back into place. Then came the sound far worse than the breathing. A low, resonant groan that vibrated through the concrete, through our bones, through every part of the building. A sound that didn't originate from its body, but from the structure itself, like the walls were finally speaking the language they'd held in silence for years. The darkness wasn't just watching now, it was awake. And it was hungry. The groan that surged through the building didn't fade the way normal sounds do. Instead, it lingered in the air like a thick vibration, shaking the dust loose from the ceiling and causing tiny fragments of plaster to drift downward in slow spirals. The entire structure seemed to inhale with us, as if it had been waiting for the perfect moment to remind us that whatever lived here wasn't merely occupying space, but was the space itself. The room pulsed once, a subtle rhythmic throb as though a heart deep inside the walls had suddenly awakened. And that was when the figure, still faceless, still impossibly tall, tilted its head in a way that simulated curiosity, yet felt far older and colder than any human gesture. It wasn't looking at us because it wanted to be understood. It was looking at us because it had already decided we understood enough. The air thickened with a new heaviness, pressing against our skin, pushing into our lungs. Every breath tasted stale, metallic, as if the atmosphere had become saturated with the ghosts of every memory this building had absorbed. My pulse pounded so loudly in my ears that it distorted my hearing. Every sound stretched, warped, mingled with the rhythmic thudding in my skull. The figure didn't move closer, but the darkness around it did, pooling outward like a spilled liquid that flowed toward our feet. It wasn't a shadow. It was thicker, more deliberate, a blackness that claimed the floor tile by tile, coming to swallow the dying remnants of light left in the room. Someone behind me whispered, "Don't move," though the voice shook so violently it was barely sound, more like a tremor escaping from a trapped breath. But the warning felt pointless because movement didn't seem like an option anymore. Our bodies weren't frozen by choice. We were rooted where we stood by something deeper, something ancient, something that radiated from the walls themselves. It was as though the building wasn't allowing us to leave, holding us in place long enough for the figure to finish whatever silent calculation it was making. Then the whispers began. At first, they were soft enough to mimic an intrusive thought, something your mind produces during moments of extreme fear. But they grew louder, distinct, multiple voices overlapping each other like a chorus of breaths funneling through broken pipes. They weren't coming from the figure. They were coming from the walls. The concrete started to tremble subtly beneath our feet, and the whispers crawled along the surfaces like a living thing. Some voices sounded panicked, some mournful, some furious. Others sounded like children, giggling, humming, repeating broken fragments of words. The building wasn't just haunted, it was communicating. It had stories trapped inside it. It had memories pressed between its layers of paint and plaster. All the suppressed pain, all the violence, all the fear, it was speaking through the walls like a collective consciousness finally finding a mouth. The figure stepped forward. Not with feet, not with weight, but with intent. The darkness beneath it surged outward in a sudden wave, freezing every muscle in my body with an electric jolt that shot up my spine. The flashlight dimmed instantly, shrinking from a full beam to a pathetic glow no brighter than a dying candle. Not because the batteries died, but because the darkness took the light, devoured it, silenced it. We watched helplessly as the last reliable anchor to reality faded into a dull ember, struggling to stay alive in an environment that rejected illumination. The voices in the walls shifted suddenly, synchronizing, merging into a single guttural whisper that rolled through the room like a command. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. But it felt like meaning existed within it, something primal, something territorial, something that said, "You shouldn't have come here." My vision blurred as the pressure in the air intensified. The figure's form wavered again, rippling like it existed between dimensions, swaying in and out of focus. The temperature plummeted so sharply that my fingers went numb, and my breath became visible, rising in thin white tendrils toward the darkness that hung above us like a second ceiling. And then, as if responding to the building's whisper, the figure extended an arm, not an arm made of flesh or bone, but an elongated distortion, stretching forward like a smear of shadow dragged across glass. Its reach was impossibly long, bending and twisting with fluid motion that defied every instinctual expectation of how a limb should move. The arm hovered inches from my face, and I felt the cold radiating from it, a cold so deep it bypassed skin and sank straight into the marrow of my bones. And then it happened. The shadow touched me. It didn't strike, didn't pull, didn't harm. It pressed. A gentle push, soft as a fingertip brushing dust from fabric. But the moment it touched, a wall of images slammed into my mind screams, slammed doors, fingernails dragging against concrete, someone begging for help, someone praying, someone whispering, "Please don't leave me here," someone laughing in a way that wasn't joyful but hysterically broken. Dozens of voices burned through my skull like shards of glass, each memory sharper than the last. The figure recoiled almost immediately, withdrawing its arm like it had taken what it needed. The darkness retreated slightly, loosening its grip on the room. The whispers softened, fracturing back into scattered fragments. The building's pulse slowed, and then just as suddenly as it appeared, it turned away. It didn't vanish. It didn't evaporate. It simply folded back into the darkness, merging with it like water absorbed by soil. The room inhaled softly, exhaled, and the light's weak trembling began to flicker back to life. The flashlight brightened enough to reveal that the figure was gone, leaving only the drag mark beneath it fading like a dissolving footprint. The oppressive weight on our lungs lifted. The whispers slid into silence. The cold eased, but the building wasn't empty. It wasn't relieved. It was quiet. The kind of quiet someone maintains after revealing just enough of a secret to keep you awake for the rest of your life. We stumbled out of that room, out of that hallway, out of that building, not because we chose to leave, but because the place finally allowed it. The night air outside felt too warm, too real, too alive. For the first time, I understood something that will haunt me forever. Some buildings don't want to hurt you. They just want to show you what they've become. And now that we had seen it, there was no one seeing it. The night outside felt unreal, like we had stepped out of a world where time was measured by heartbeat instead of clocks. The sky looked wrong, too open, too vast, too indifferent. The streetlights hummed with a warmth that felt foreign after the cold that had seeped into our bones inside that building. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We didn't even look at each other. It was as though the entire group silently agreed that acknowledging what had happened would make it real again, like speaking it aloud might summon something we had barely escaped. Our footsteps on the pavement sounded offensively loud, echoing too sharply, as if the night disliked sudden noises and wanted to swallow them back into its void. When we reached the car, the engine struggled for a second, just a flicker, a hesitation, but enough to make every hair on my arm stand up. It eventually turned over, and the headlights cutting through the darkness felt like a lifeline. But even as the road passed beneath us, even as the building shrank into the distance, something didn't leave. The silence inside the car wasn't relief. It was tension. Like an invisible passenger had taken the seat between us, watching, listening, learning us. Every mile we put between ourselves, and that place didn't loosen its grip. If anything, it tightened. Memories replayed in flashes, the whispering walls, the suffocating darkness, the shadow leaning toward us without moving. And behind all those images lurked the one thing I couldn't shake, the sensation of that cold, impossible touch. A feeling that had embedded itself deep under the skin, impossible to rub away. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. You could feel it, the awareness, the hum, the echo. Shadows in the corner of the room seemed thicker than they should be. The air felt subtly displaced, as if something moved through it without making sound. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispers tried to stitch themselves back together in my mind, forming words I didn't want to hear. And the cold? That cold lingered in my bones, like a permanent bruise left by something that didn't understand or didn't care about the fragility of human flesh. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was trauma, stress, imagination, that buildings don't have memories, that darkness can't think, that shadows can't touch. But then little things started happening, objects shifting from where I left them, lights flickering even during calm weather, that faint metallic smell appearing randomly in the air. And sometimes, just before falling asleep, I would hear a soft tap on the wall. A tap too deliberate, too rhythmic, too familiar. Like someone was tracing their fingers across the surface, just like in the hallway. Just like before the figure appeared. The realization hit slowly, creeping in like a draft under a locked door. We didn't bring something back. We awakened it. The building hadn't shown us what it was because it wanted to frighten us. It had shown us because it wanted to be known, recognized, remembered. It had lived in that sealed tomb of concrete for so long that any form of acknowledgement, fear, curiosity, dread, was nourishment. We hadn't escaped it. We had connected to it. We had given it attention, and in doing so, we had given it permission. I still see it sometimes. Not fully, not clearly, but in brief distortions when a shadow flickers wrong or a reflection in a window lags a half second behind my movement. The presence is never aggressive. It doesn't harm. It doesn't pursue. It simply observes. It watches the way a building watches weather quietly, endlessly, without blinking. And I have come to understand something I didn't want to admit. Some places don't haunt you because they are evil. They haunt you because they are lonely, because you heard them, because you felt them breathe. And once you've heard the walls speak, once you've felt the darkness reach out with a curious hand, once you've become part of the memory that place guards so jealously, you never truly leave. The building no longer needs you inside its halls. It carries its halls inside you. In the end, some stories don't fade when the doors close or when the lights finally return. Some stories cling to the edges of memory like dust that refuses to be swept away, lingering in the corners no matter how many times you tell yourself it's gone. Tonight's journey wasn't just a descent into a forgotten building or the shadows that lived inside it. It was a reminder that every place, every room, every wall with a history keeps something of the people who passed through it, their voices, their fear, their pain, their hope. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, those places whisper back. What we witnessed wasn't just darkness, it was loneliness with a heartbeat. It was an echo that found a new surface to cling to. A presence that no longer needs four walls and a roof to exist. Because once a story like this touches you, once you become part of something that time tried so hard to bury, it never fully lets go. So as you turn off this video, as the room around you settles into silence and your mind retraces the hallway we walked together, remember this. Some places are forgotten for a reason. Some memories stay hidden because they were meant to. And some shadows only need a single moment of recognition to follow you home. Thank you for joining me in the dark tonight. Stay aware, stay cautious, and above all, stay curious, but not so curious that the next story ends up being yours. Good night.